Please subscribe to the channel to help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Today, I'm going to tell you something that happened to me about a year ago. A lot of people don't believe this story, but I swear to you, it's real. For a while, I even doubted myself. But now, I'm absolutely certain that it all actually happened. Look, I'm not one for spooky stories around the campfire, okay? I'm a practical guy. I like things that make sense, rational explanations. But what happened to me? It defies logic. It haunts me. And maybe, just maybe, after you hear it, it'll haunt you too. It all started with a delivery, or rather a non-delivery. I was working my dead-end part-time job at Outdoor Adventures, a camping supply store on the edge of town, right next to the Appalachian Trail. The kind of place that smells perpetually of dust and mothballs. My life was predictable, boring, even. Until that day, I was prepping a big order for a group of college kids heading out on some wilderness expedition. Rich kids, playing at being rugged. The kind of people who buy $500 tents they'll use once. I was secretly jealous, of course. I'd kill to be out there, exploring the mountains, or at least exploring them with her. Lila. Yeah, I know, cliché. The cute, mysterious girl who shops at your store. She had this wild, dark hair, and these eyes that seemed to shift between green and gray depending on the light. And a smile. That, well, let's just say it made it hard to concentrate on stocking shelves. She was a regular, always buying gear for her solo hikes. Me? I was lucky if I could stammer out a coherent sentence about carabiners or water filters when she was around. Anyway, I was finishing up, lost in my usual daydream about Lila actually noticing me, when I heard this sound. Outside. It was weird. A kind of chittering, growling noise, like an animal, but not one I recognized. Now, this store was right on the edge of the woods. We got the occasional deer or raccoon wandering into the parking lot. But this was different. It had an unsettling quality. A prickling the hairs on your neck kind of vibe. So, naturally, I had to check it out. I stepped outside, the late afternoon sun casting long, distorted shadows from the trees. The sound came again, closer now. I followed it, my heart rate picking up. Not from fear, not yet. It was more like anticipation, like something significant was about to happen. And then, I saw her. Crouched down near a bush, huddled like a scared animal, was a kid. Couldn't have been more than 6 or 7. Skinny, clothes ripped and filthy, hair a tangled mess of leaves and dirt. But it was the eyes. Huge, dark, and wide with a kind of feral intensity. "Hey," I said softly, approaching slowly. "Are you okay? Are you lost?" Nothing. Just that stare. Those eyes that seemed to see right through you. And then, the sound again. That chittering, growling, like she was trying to speak, but the words wouldn't come. I stood there, frozen. What the hell do you do in that situation? The kid cowered, like she expected me to attack. I tried to smile, to look non-threatening. "It's okay," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm not going to hurt you. Do you need help?" Silence, just that unwavering stare. And then, she did something that completely threw me. She crouched lower and started drawing in the dirt with her finger. Not random scribbles. These were symbols. Straight lines, curves, spirals, forming intricate, unsettling patterns. Things I'd never seen before. I was mesmerized. What did they mean? Where did this kid come from? And the most pressing question, what the hell was I supposed to do with her? Night was coming fast. The forest, which had seemed peaceful just minutes before, now felt menacing, full of unseen things, whispers. I couldn't leave her there, but taking her into town, this wasn't exactly a welcoming place. Small town, suspicious of outsiders, and a wild child appearing out of nowhere, with those eyes, those symbols. They'd freak. But I didn't have a choice, did I? I took a deep breath. "Come with me," I said, holding out my hand. "I'll help you." She hesitated, just for a second. And then, she took my hand. Her skin was cold, rough, like bark. And together, we walked out of the deepening shadows of the forest, toward the lights of the town. Little did I know, we were taking the first step into a mystery that would unravel everything I thought I knew about the world, and about myself. And maybe, just maybe, it will start to unravel things for you. Are you ready for that? Because once you start down this path, there's no going back. The walk back to the store felt longer than it should have. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made me jump. The kid, I still didn't even know her name, didn't make a sound. Just held my hand tight, her small, cold fingers wrapped around mine. It was unsettling, and yet strangely comforting. Like I was responsible for something fragile, something important. As we got closer to the town's edge, I started to second-guess myself. This was a terrible idea. Sheriff Harris, the local law enforcement, and pretty much the only law enforcement, was a stickler for rules. And he wasn't exactly known for his open-mindedness. He'd take one look at this kid, with her wild eyes and dirt-caked clothes, and jump to all kinds of wrong conclusions. But what else could I do? Leave her in the woods? No way. I decided to take her to my place first. It was a small, run-down apartment, above a hardware store, but it was better than nothing. Maybe I could clean her up, give her some food, figure out a plan. The town square was mostly deserted at this hour. A few old-timers sat on benches, watching us with narrowed eyes as we passed. I tried to look casual, like a guy walking with his niece? Cousin? It was a pathetic attempt, I'm sure. We reached my building without incident, which was a small miracle. I unlocked the door, ushered the kid inside, and locked it again, quickly. The apartment was a mess, as usual. Clothes piled on the floor, dishes in the sink, empty pizza boxes stacked on the coffee table. My life, in a nutshell. Okay, I said, trying to sound confident. This is home, for now. The kid just stared at me. Then, she walked over to the wall and started tracing patterns on it with her finger. The same patterns she'd drawn in the dirt. My stomach clenched. This wasn't just random scribbling. This was something else. I tried to distract her. Are you hungry? I've got, leftover pizza? She ignored me, completely engrossed in her wall art. I rummaged through the fridge, found a half-eaten box of pepperoni, and put it in the microwave. The smell of reheated pizza filled the apartment, a pathetically normal smell in the midst of this increasingly bizarre situation. She finally looked up when I put the box on the table. Hesitantly, she reached out, grabbed a slice, and started eating. Slowly at first, then faster, like she hadn't eaten in days. Which I realized was probably true. "What's your name?" I asked gently. She just stared at me, chewing. Can you tell me anything? Where you came from?" Nothing. Just those eyes, and those damned symbols on the wall. I spent the next hour trying to get something out of her. I tried drawing pictures. I tried pointing at things and saying their names. Nothing worked. It was like she was from another planet. That's when the knocking started, a heavy, insistent pounding on the door. My heart leaped into my throat. Sheriff Harris. It had to be. I glanced at the kid. She was staring at the door, her eyes wide, her body tense. She knew. "Stay here," I whispered. "Don't make a sound." I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. Yep, Sheriff Harris, looking grim and impatient. And behind him, a couple of the town's more colorful characters. Old Man Hemlock, who claimed he could talk to trees, and Mrs. Gable, who ran the local bakery and was convinced the government was putting mind-control drugs in the flour. Great, just great. I took a deep breath and opened the door. "Sheriff," I said, trying to sound casual. "What can I do for you?" He pushed past me, his eyes scanning the apartment. "We got a report. Disturbance. Someone saw you walking with a child. A strange child." "A child?" I feigned innocence. "I don't know what you're talking about." It was a lie, of course. A stupid, obvious lie. and Harris knew it. "Don't play dumb with me, boy," he growled. "Where is it?" "It?" I was stalling, desperately trying to think of a way out of this. That's when Mrs. Gable shrieked. "There! On the wall! The devil's markings!" She was pointing at the symbols the kid had drawn. Hemlock started muttering about ancient curses and forest spirits. Harris just stared, his face hardening. "Where is the child?" he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. I knew I was screwed. There was no way to explain this. No way to make them understand. Then, a voice. Small, hesitant, but clear. "Here." We all turned. The kid was standing in the doorway of the bedroom, her eyes fixed on the sheriff. And for the first time she had spoken. But it wasn't her voice. It was deeper, older. And it sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Night air, because the voice that came out of that little girl's mouth was Lila's. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Sheriff Harris, Old Man Hemlock, and Mrs. Gable, the unholy trinity of small-town suspicion, just stared, mouths agape, at the child who stood framed in the doorway. Lila's voice, or rather, a distorted, unsettling echo of it, hung in the air like a phantom. Even I, who had been expecting something strange, was completely unprepared for this. It was like a scene from a bad horror movie, except it was real, and it was happening in my crummy apartment. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Any explanation that didn't involve possession, body snatching, or some other equally insane concept. Mimicry? Maybe the kid had heard Lila's voice before, somewhere, and was just repeating it? It was a flimsy theory, even to me, but it was all I had. Harris was the first to recover, his hand instinctively moving to the gun on his hip. He took a step toward the child, his eyes narrowed, a mixture of fear and anger swirling in them. "What in God's name?" he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Old Man Hemlock, his face ashen, started rambling about ancient spirits and vengeful gods, his words a jumbled mess of folklore and superstition. Mrs. Gable, bless her heart, just fainted dead away, collapsing in a heap of floral print fabric and powdered sugar. I guess the mind-controlled drugs in the flour hadn't prepared her for this. I moved to stand between the sheriff and the child, a protective instinct kicking in, even though I had no idea what I was protecting her from, or who. I was protecting her against. "Sheriff, wait," I pleaded, my voice trembling. "She's just a kid. She's scared. She doesn't understand." "Doesn't understand?" Harris barked, his eyes still locked on the child. "That ain't no ordinary kid, boy. And that ain't Lila's voice. Something ain't right here. Something unnatural." The child, or whatever was inhabiting her, tilted her head, a slow, deliberate movement that sent another shiver down my spine. Her eyes, those unsettlingly dark eyes, seemed to bore into me, searching for something. Then she spoke again, still in that unnervingly familiar voice. "Ethan, help." It was a plea, a desperate whisper that cut through the tension in the room like a knife. But it was also wrong. Lila wouldn't call me for help like she would try to solve that alone. And, more importantly, how did this thing know my name? I hadn't told her. I hadn't told anyone. Before I could react, before I could even process what was happening, the child darted forward, moving with a speed and agility that seemed impossible for someone her size. She slipped past Harris, past the unconscious Mrs. Gable, and out the door, disappearing into the night. Harris swore, a string of curses that would have made a sailor blush. He started to go after her, but I grabbed his arm. "Wait!" I yelled. "You can't just chase her! She's... I trailed off, unable to find the words. I didn't know what she was, but I knew one thing. She needed help, and somehow I felt like I was the only one who could give it to her. Or at least, it was the only thing I was sure about. Harris glared at me, his face red with fury. "You're protecting it, boy. You're siding with that thing." "I'm not siding with anyone," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I don't think you understand what's going on here. We need to figure this out before someone gets hurt." He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine. Then, with a sigh of resignation, he holstered his gun. "All right, boy," he said, his voice heavy with doubt. "But you're on thin ice, real thin. And if that thing harms anyone in this town, I'm holding you personally responsible." With that, he turned and stormed out of the apartment, leaving me alone with the lingering scent of fear, the unconscious Mrs. Gable, and the unsettling symbols scrawled on my wall. A symbol that I was certain was not there before. The night, it seemed, was just getting started, and I had a sinking feeling that things were about to get a whole lot stranger, the kind that defies all explanation. I got up, checking if Mrs. Gable was okay. I returned to my room looking at the wall. I swear that symbol had not been there before, and it was familiar, as if I had seen it before. But when? Where? The next few hours were a blur of frantic activity and mounting dread. Mrs. Gable eventually came to, sputtering about demons and the end of days, and I managed to get her back to her bakery, promising to check on her later. Sheriff Harris, true to his word, put the entire town on alert. He didn't say what they were on alert for exactly. I doubt he could have even articulated it himself, but the message was clear. Something strange was happening, and everyone needed to be vigilant. News spread like wildfire, fueled by rumors and speculation. People whispered about the wild child, the devil's markings, and the possessed girl. Some blamed it on the upcoming solar eclipse, others on the new cell phone tower that had been erected on the outskirts of town. The usual small-town paranoia, amplified tenfold by the genuinely inexplicable events of the night. I tried to stay out of it, to focus on figuring out what the hell was going on with the kid. But it was impossible. Everywhere I went, I saw eyes watching me, judging me. I was the outsider, the one who had brought this thing into their peaceful, predictable lives. I went back to my apartment, hoping to find some clue, some explanation in the symbols the child had drawn. I stared at them for hours, tracing their lines with my finger, trying to decipher their meaning. They were intricate, geometric, almost hypnotic, and they seemed to be evolving, changing, subtly, each time I looked at them. That's when I noticed something else. The air in my apartment felt different, charged, like before a thunderstorm, and there was a faint, almost imperceptible hum vibrating just at the edge of my hearing. It made my teeth ache. I tried calling Lila, again and again, straight to voicemail. Each unanswered call tightened the knot of anxiety in my stomach. The child's use of her voice. It couldn't be a coincidence. There had to be a connection. But what? Then, the disappearances started. First, it was pets. Cats, dogs, even a couple of prize-winning rabbits from old Mrs. Henderson's farm. Gone, without a trace. No signs of struggle, no tracks, nothing. Just vanished. Then, it was livestock. A few chickens from Farmer McGregor's coop. A couple of goats from the Miller family's pasture. Again, no explanation. Just gone. The town was on the verge of a full-blown panic. Sheriff Harris organized search. Parties scouring the woods, the fields, the surrounding areas. But they found nothing. It was like the earth had swallowed these creatures whole. And then, the whispers started. People reported hearing faint, indistinct voices in the forest at night. Whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Whispers that spoke of things that shouldn't be spoken of. Ancient things, forgotten things, dangerous things. I heard them too, one night, as I was walking home from the store. They seemed to be calling my name, beckoning me into the darkness. A cold, primal fear gripped me, and I ran, not stopping until I was safely inside my locked apartment. The next morning, I found something outside my door. A small pile of bones. Animal bones, I think. Arranged in a pattern. A pattern that looked disturbingly familiar. It was one of the symbols the child had drawn. That's when I knew. This wasn't just some random act of vandalism, some prank by a disturbed kid. This was something bigger, something older, something that was connected to the forest, to the town, and somehow to me and Lila. I had a choice. I run, hide from all, or try to find out. Running wasn't an option. Not anymore. The whispers, the disappearances, the symbols, it all pointed to something real, something happening right here, right now. And Lila. The thought of her being somehow caught up in this, lost and vulnerable, spurred me on. I couldn't just abandon her. I couldn't abandon the town, even if they saw me as the cause of all their troubles. I decided to focus on the symbols. They were the key. I was sure of it. If I could understand them, maybe I could understand what was happening. And maybe, just maybe, I could find Lila. I spent the next day at the local library, poring over books on mythology, folklore, ancient languages, anything that might shed some light on those strange, unsettling patterns. The librarian, a kindly old woman named Mrs. Davies, gave me curious looks, but she didn't ask any questions. She just pointed me to the relevant sections and left me. To my research, hours passed and I found nothing. Or at least, nothing that made sense. There were hints, fragments, whispers of similar symbols in various cultures, but nothing concrete. Nothing that connected them to a specific entity, a specific ritual, a specific threat. Frustrated, I slammed a book shut, the sound echoing through the quiet library. Mrs. Davies jumped, her eyes wide with alarm. I mumbled an apology and slumped back in my chair, defeated. That's when I saw it. A small, faded photograph tucked into the back of a book on local history. It showed a group of men standing in front of a cave, and carved into the rock face above the cave entrance were the symbols. My heart leaped. This was it. This was the connection I'd been looking for. The caption under the photograph read, "Explorers at entrance to Devil's Den, circa 1923. Cave subsequently sealed due to unexplained phenomena. Devil's Den." The name sent a shiver down my spine. But it was also a location, a place I could go, a place I could investigate. I rushed out of the library, ignoring Mrs. Davies' startled calls. I needed to find that cave, and I needed to find it now. I went back to the outdoor adventures store, grabbed a backpack, and started stuffing it with supplies. Flashlight, rope, water, first aid kit, a map of the area. And on a whim, I grabbed a small, handheld video camera. I wasn't sure why exactly. Maybe I wanted to document what I found. Maybe I wanted proof, in case things went bad. As I was leaving the store, I saw Jake, one of my few friends in town. He was leaning against his truck, smoking a cigarette, his face etched with worry. "Ethan," he said, his voice low. "Have you heard? They found something in the woods, near Farmer McGregor's place." My blood ran cold. "What? What did they find?" He hesitated, looking around nervously. "Bones," he whispered. "Lots of them. And symbols. Like the ones that kid drew." I didn't say anything. I just nodded, my mind racing. "Look," Jake continued, "I don't know what's going on, but I'm scared, man. We all are. And a lot of people are talking about you. About how you brought that thing into town." "I know," I said, my voice flat. "But I'm trying to fix it. I'm going to find out what's happening." He looked at me, his eyes searching mine. "How?" I took a deep breath. "I found something. A clue. I'm going to check it out." He stared at me for a long moment, then flicked his cigarette to the ground and crushed it with his boot. "I'm coming with you," he said. I hesitated. This was dangerous. I didn't want to put him at risk. But I also knew I could use the help, and honestly, I was terrified of going alone. "All right," I said. "But you need to know, this might be bad. Really bad." He nodded, his face grim. "I know." And so, together, we set off into the darkening woods, following a faded photograph and a desperate hope, towards a place called Devil's Den. A place where I suspected the answers to this terrifying mystery, and the fate of Lila awaited us. The air grew colder with every step we put toward the forest. The trek to Devil's Den was harder than I'd anticipated. The old map was vague, and the trails were overgrown, choked with thorny bushes and fallen trees. The forest itself seemed to resist our passage, the branches snagging at our clothes, the roots tripping our feet. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and a strange, oppressive silence descended, broken only by the crunch of our boots on the undergrowth and the occasional, unnerving caw of a crow. Jake, usually a chatterbox, was uncharacteristically quiet. He kept glancing over his shoulder, his hand never far from the hunting knife he carried on his belt. I couldn't blame him. I felt it too, that prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the feeling of being watched, of being hunted. After what felt like hours, we finally found it. A dark, gaping maw in the side of a rocky hill, partially obscured by a tangle of vines and gnarled trees. Devil's Den. The symbols were there, just like in the photograph, carved into the rock face above the entrance. But they were different, more elaborate, more alive. They seemed to pulse with a faint inner light, a sickly green glow that made my stomach churn. "This is it," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "This is where it all started." Jake swallowed hard, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination. "What do we do now?" I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. "We go in." He looked at me like I was crazy. "Are you serious? Ethan, this is insane. We don't know what's in there." "I know," I said, "but we have to. Lila, she might be connected to this place." He hesitated, then nodded, his jaw set with grim determination. "All right, let's do it." We switched on our flashlights, the beams cutting through the oppressive darkness of the cave entrance. The air inside was cold, damp, and heavy with a smell I couldn't quite place, a mixture of decay and something else. Something metallic. The cave sloped downward, twisting and turning, leading us deeper and deeper into the earth. The walls were slick with moisture, and the silence was almost deafening, broken only by the drip, drip, drip of water and the echo of our own footsteps. As we went further, the symbols on the walls became more frequent, more elaborate. They seemed to writhe and shift in the periphery of my vision, playing tricks on my eyes. I started to feel dizzy, disoriented, like the cave itself was messing with my head. Then, we reached a large chamber, and we saw it. In the center of the chamber, there was a structure, a kind of altar made of rough-hewn stone, and on the altar, bones. Human bones, I was sure of it, arranged in a pattern, the same pattern as the symbols. Around the altar there were other things, objects, strange twisted metal sculptures, dried herbs and roots hanging from the ceiling, and drawings, crude but disturbing, depicting figures with elongated limbs and distorted faces, engaged in rituals. My stomach lurched. This wasn't just some abandoned cave. This was a place of worship, a place of sacrifice. Jake let out a strangled cry, pointing to something on the far side of the chamber. "Ethan, look." I followed his gaze, and I saw it. A small, wooden cage. And inside the cage, it was empty. But on the floor of the cage, there was a single familiar object, a hair tie. A green braided hair tie that I'd seen Lila wearing countless times. My blood turned to ice. She had been here. She had been in that cage. "Lila," I whispered, my voice choked with emotion. Then, a sound. A low, guttural growl coming from the back of the chamber. We whirled around, our flashlights illuminating nothing, just shadows. But the growl came again, closer this time. And then, another sound. A faint, rhythmic chanting, echoing through the cave. We were not alone. I felt a hand grip my arm, tight. Jake's face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. "We need to go," he whispered, his voice trembling. We need to get out of here, now. I knew he was right, but I couldn't leave, not without Lila. No, I said, my voice shaking. We have to find her. And, as if in answer to my words, the chanting grew louder, closer, and the shadows in the chamber began to move. The chanting intensified, weaving itself into a hypnotic, unsettling rhythm that seemed to vibrate the very air around us. It was a chorus of guttural voices, rising and falling in a cadence that felt both ancient and utterly alien. The shadows in the chamber deepened, coalescing into shapes that shifted and writhed just beyond the reach of our flashlight beams. Panic, raw and primal, clawed at my throat, threatening to suffocate me. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee this unholy place and never look back. But the image of Lila's hair tie, lying forlornly in that empty cage, anchored me to the spot. I couldn't leave her, not like this. Jake, however, was past the point of reason. His grip on my arm tightened, his nails digging into my skin. "Ethan, we have to go," he hissed, his voice a desperate plea. This is beyond us. We're not equipped for this." He was right, of course. We were two guys with flashlights, and a hunting knife, facing something. Something we couldn't even comprehend. But logic had no place here. Not anymore. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of fear that was clouding my mind. "No," I repeated, my voice firmer this time, though it still trembled. "We can't. She's here. Somewhere. I have to find her." I pulled my arm free from his, grasp, my eyes scanning the chamber, searching for any sign, any clue. The chanting reached a crescendo, a deafening roar that seemed to press in on us from all sides. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. It was broken only by the sound of our own ragged breathing, and the faint, sickening drip, drip, drip of water from the cave ceiling. And then, another sound, a soft, shuffling noise, coming from one of the dark tunnels that led off from the main chamber. My flashlight beam darted towards the sound, illuminating nothing. Just the rough, uneven walls of the tunnel, disappearing into inky blackness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing strangely in the silence. "Is anyone there?" No answer, just the shuffling, growing closer. I took a step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. Jake grabbed my arm again, his face a mask of terror. "Ethan, don't go in there." I ignored him. I had to know. I had to see. I took another step, and another, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, revealing a figure. Standing in the mouth of the tunnel, silhouetted against the deeper blackness beyond, a figure that was familiar. Tall, slender, with long dark hair. "Lila?" I whispered, my voice filled with a mixture of hope and disbelief. The figure didn't answer. It just stood there, motionless, watching me. I took another step, my hand reaching out. "Lila, is that you? Are you okay?" The figure stepped forward into the light, and I saw her face. It was Lila, but it wasn't. Her eyes were blank, devoid of any emotion, any recognition. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her lips were drawn back in a thin, unnatural smile. She looked empty, like a shell. Puppet, controlled by something else. "Lila," I said again, my voice a strangled whisper. What happened to you?" She tilted her head, that same slow, deliberate movement I'd seen in the child. And then, she spoke. But it wasn't her voice. It was that same distorted, unsettling echo, the voice that had come from the child in my apartment. "Ethan, join us." The words hung in the air, cold and heavy, filled with a menace that sent a wave of nausea through me. I stumbled back, my hand flying to my mouth, trying to stifle a scream. Behind me, I heard Jake yell, "Run, Ethan, run!" But I couldn't move. I was frozen, trapped between the terror of what I was seeing and the desperate, irrational hope that somehow, somewhere, the real Lila was still in there. That I could save her. The figure that looked like Lila took another step forward, its hand outstretched, its fingers long and skeletal. And in that moment, I knew. This wasn't a rescue mission. It was a trap. And I had walked right into it. The floor gave way before I could even start to make a move. The floor vanished beneath my feet with a sickening crunch of crumbling rock and loose earth. I flailed wildly, my arms grasping for purchase, but there was nothing to hold on to. I plunged into darkness, the scream ripped from my throat swallowed by the echoing roar of falling debris. The impact, when it came, knocked the wind out of me, driving the air from my lungs in a whoosh of pain. I lay there for a moment, stunned, my body screaming in protest, trying to assess the damage. Miraculously, nothing seemed broken. I was bruised, battered, and covered in dust, but I was alive. I pushed myself up, wincing, and fumbled for my flashlight. It had survived the fall, miraculously, and its beam cut through the thick, choking dust, revealing my surroundings. I was in a tunnel, or rather, a continuation of the cave system, but this one was different. The walls were smoother, almost worked, and the symbols, they were everywhere, covering every surface, floor to ceiling. A dizzying, hypnotic tapestry of lines and curves. They seemed to pulse with that same faint green light I'd seen at the cave entrance, illuminating the tunnel with an eerie, otherworldly glow. The air was heavy, thick with that same metallic scent I'd noticed before, but now it was stronger, almost overpowering. It made my head spin, my stomach churn. And the silence. It was absolute, unnatural. The chanting, the growling, Jake's screams, all gone. I was alone. Utterly, terrifyingly alone. I took a shaky breath and started to move, following the tunnel, my flashlight beam dancing ahead of me. I had no idea where I was going, but I had to keep moving. I had to find a way out, and I had to find Lila. The tunnel twisted and turned, leading me deeper and deeper into the earth. The symbols on the walls seemed to writhe and shift as I passed, their patterns becoming more complex, more disturbing. I started to see images within them, fleeting glimpses of things that defied description. Faces, distorted and grotesque. Creatures, twisted and unnatural. Rituals, violent and bloody. I tried to ignore them, to focus on my surroundings, but they pressed in on me, invading my mind, filling me with a growing sense of dread and despair. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality, like the cave itself was trying to swallow me whole, to absorb me into its ancient, unknowable secrets. Then, I heard it, a faint, rhythmic drumming, echoing through the tunnels. It was slow, deliberate, hypnotic, and it seemed to be coming from everywhere. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest, my steps hesitant and uncertain. The drumming grew, louder, closer, and I could feel the vibrations in the floor, in the walls, in my very bones. The tunnel opened into a large cavern, and I stopped dead, my breath catching in my throat. The cavern was lit by a flickering, greenish fire, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. In the center of the cavern, there was a pit, a deep, dark hole from which the drumming seemed to emanate. And around the pit, figures, dozens of them, tall, slender, their bodies covered in something. Dirt? Ash? Paint? It was hard to tell in the flickering light. They were swaying back and forth, their heads bowed, their hands raised in a gesture of worship, supplication, and they were chanting. The same guttural, unsettling chant I'd heard in the upper chamber, but now it was amplified, intensified, a wave of sound that washed over me, threatening to drown me. I stood there, frozen, hidden in the shadows, watching this spectacle. This was the lost tribe, I realized. The tribe that Martha had spoken of. The tribe that had haunted the legends of this town for generations. But they weren't just legends. They were real. And they were terrifying. Then, I saw her. Lila, standing at the edge of the pit, her back to me. She was wearing a robe, a white flowing robe stained with something dark. And her hair, it was loose, falling down her back, framing her pale, expressionless face. She was still empty. But there was something else now. A power. A dark, unsettling energy that radiated from her, making the air around her shimmer. The chanting reached a fever pitch, the drumming a frantic crescendo. And then Lila raised her hands, and the pit began to glow. A sickly green light erupted from the depths, casting grotesque shadows on the faces of the chanting figures. And I saw something rising from the pit. Something huge. Something wrong. It was a shape, a form that defied description. A writhing mass of tentacles and eyes and mouths, pulsating with that same unholy light. It was an abomination. A creature from a nightmare. And Lila, she was smiling. The sight of that thing rising from the pit was enough to shatter whatever remained of my composure. It was a violation of everything I thought I knew about the world. A grotesque mockery of nature. A physical manifestation of pure, unadulterated horror. My mind recoiled, screaming at me to run, to escape, to put as much distance as possible between myself and this unholy spectacle. But I couldn't. My legs were rooted to the spot, my body paralyzed with terror. And my eyes were fixed on Lila. Her smile, that chilling, unnatural smile, widened as the creature emerged further from the pit, its tentacles reaching out, grasping at the air, its multiple eyes, cold and black and devoid of any semblance of life, scanning the cavern. It was a scene straight out of a nightmare, a Lovecraftian horror brought to life. And Lila, my Lila, was at the center of it all, seemingly in control, seemingly reveling in it. The chanting figures prostrated themselves before the monstrous entity, their guttural voices rising in a frenzy of adoration and fear. The drumming intensified, a pounding rhythm that echoed the frantic beating of my own heart. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, the metallic scent in the air growing so strong that it made me gag. I wanted to scream, to cry, to beg for it, all to stop, but the words were caught in my throat, trapped by the sheer, overwhelming terror of the moment. Then, Lila spoke. Her voice, still distorted, still carrying that unsettling echo, cut through the cacophony like a knife. "Ethan," she said, her eyes, those blank, empty eyes, locking onto mine. "You have come." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. A statement of fact. And it filled me with a new wave of dread, a dread that went beyond the immediate horror of the situation. She knew I was there. She had expected me. I tried to speak, to deny it, to plead with her. But my voice failed me. I could only manage a choked, gasping sound, a pathetic whimper of fear. Lila, or whatever was controlling her, turned her attention back to the creature, raising her hands in a gesture of offering. "Master," she said, her voice filled with a reverence that made my skin crawl. "I bring you a gift." The creature's tentacles writhed, its eyes focused on Lila, and then slowly, deliberately, they turned towards me, towards my hiding place in the shadows. I was discovered. Panic surged through me, overriding my paralysis. I turned to run, to flee back into the tunnels, to escape this nightmare. But it was too late. The chanting figures rose, their faces, now visible in the flickering light, contorted in expressions of hunger. They were human. Or at least, they had been. But their eyes were like Lila's, blank, empty, and their skin, it was covered in the same symbols that adorned the cave walls, etched into their flesh with something sharp and cruel. They lunged at me, their hands outstretched, their fingers tipped with long, sharp claws. I screamed, a primal scream of terror and despair, and raised my arms to defend myself, but it was no use. They were too many, too strong. They dragged me from my hiding place, their claws tearing at my clothes, at my skin. I struggled, kicking and punching, but it was like fighting a swarm of insects. They were relentless, unstoppable, They dragged me to the edge of the pit, to the feet of the monstrous entity, and threw me down, face to face with Lila. She looked down at me, her expression unchanged. That same chilling smile, those same empty eyes. "Ethan," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. "You will join us. You will become one with the Master." And then, she reached out, her hand hovering over my face, and I saw, etched into her palm, the same symbol that had been outside my apartment door. The symbol of the bones. The symbol of the thing in the pit. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the inevitable. For the pain, the horror, the transformation. But it didn't come. Instead, I heard a shout, a roar of defiance, and then the sound of fighting. The shout was followed by a cacophony of sounds, the guttural cries of the chanting figures, the sickening thud of flesh on flesh, and a new sound, a desperate, animalistic snarl that I recognized instantly. It was Jake. I opened my eyes, blinking against the flickering green light, and saw a scene of utter chaos. Jake was fighting his way through the crowd of chanting figures, wielding his hunting knife with a ferocity I hadn't known he possessed. He was outnumbered, outmatched, but he fought with the desperation of a cornered animal, driven by a loyalty and a courage that defied the overwhelming odds. He was buying me time. I scrambled to my feet, my body aching, my mind reeling. I had to do something. I couldn't just stand there and watch him die. But what could I do? I was unarmed, surrounded by enemies, facing a creature that defied comprehension. Then, I saw it. Lying on the ground near the edge of the pit was a rock. A large, jagged piece of stone, dislodged from the cave wall. It was heavy, unwieldy, but it was the only weapon I had. I lunged for it, my fingers wrapping around its rough surface. It was heavier than I expected, but I managed to lift it, staggering under its weight. The chanting figures were closing in again, their eyes fixed on me, their claws outstretched, but I ignored them. My focus was on Lila, or rather, on the thing that was controlling her. I raised the rock above my head, my arms screaming in protest, and brought it down with all my strength on the symbol etched into her palm. A sickening crack echoed through the cavern, followed by a high-pitched shriek that seemed to tear through the very fabric of reality. Lila, or the thing possessing her, stumbled back, clutching her hand, her eyes widening in surprise, pain. It was hard to tell. The chanting stopped. The drumming ceased. The monstrous creature in the pit recoiled. Its tentacles writhed, its eyes flickered, and it emitted a low, guttural groan that sounded like fear. The sudden silence was deafening. Then, Lila collapsed. I dropped the rock, my arms numb, my legs shaking. I rushed to her side, kneeling beside her, my heart pounding in my chest. "Lila!" I cried, my voice hoarse. "Lila, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I saw her, the real Lila. Her eyes, no longer blank and empty, but filled with confusion, fear, and recognition. "Ethan?" she whispered, her voice weak. What happened?" I couldn't answer. I just held her, tears streaming down my face, relief washing over me in a wave so powerful it almost knocked me off my feet. But the relief was short-lived. The chanting figures were recovering, their eyes turning towards us, their faces contorting in renewed anger. And the creature in the pit, it was stirring again. We were still trapped, still in danger. Then a new sound, a deep, rumbling noise coming from above. The cave ceiling began to crack, fissures spreading across the rock like spiderwebs. Dust and debris rained down on us, and the entire chamber started to shake. An earthquake? No, something else. Something deliberate. A section of the ceiling collapsed, revealing a gaping hole, and through the hole I saw light. The faint, gray light of dawn. And then figures, descending from the hole, on ropes, on ladders. Figures in uniforms. Sheriff Harris, and behind him, a group of men and women in hazmat suits. They had found us. The next few hours were a blur. The chanting figures were subdued. The creature in the pit, it was contained. I don't know how, I don't know what they did, but they managed to neutralize it. Lila and I were pulled from the cave, along with Jake, who was battered and bruised but miraculously alive. We were taken to a facility, somewhere outside of town, debriefed, examined, questioned. They asked us about the cave, about the symbols, about the chanting figures, about the creature. We told them everything we could, everything we remembered. But I knew, deep down, that they wouldn't understand, that they couldn't understand. Lila remembered nothing of her time in the cave. She remembered going for a walk in the woods, and then nothing. Until she woke up in my arms, surrounded by chaos and the faint, sickly green light. Eventually, they let us go. They told us to forget what we had seen, to move on with our lives. They said it was all a hallucination, a mass hysteria brought on by stress, by the upcoming eclipse, by something. But I knew the truth. And Lila, I suspected, knew it too. We left the town together. We couldn't stay. Not after what we had seen, what we had experienced. The child, she was gone. Vanished. As if she had never existed. The disappearances stopped. The whispers ceased. The town, slowly, painfully, returned to normal. But we would never be the same. We were marked, changed, by the things we had seen, by the things we had touched, by the things we had almost become. And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I still hear the chanting. I still see the symbols, and I still wonder, what was that thing in the pit? And what did it want? And most importantly, was it really gone? The world outside our small town felt wrong. Too bright, too loud, too normal. After the oppressive darkness of the cave, the suffocating silence, the sheer, unadulterated otherness of it all, the mundane reality of everyday life seemed like a flimsy facade, a thin veil stretched over something ancient and terrifying. Lila and I drifted for a while, moving from town to town, staying in cheap motels, working odd jobs. We didn't talk much about what had happened. It was too raw, too painful, too unbelievable. But it was always there, unspoken, hanging between us like a shroud. The shared trauma, the shared knowledge, the shared fear. We eventually settled in a small coastal city, far from the mountains, far from the forest. We found a tiny apartment overlooking the ocean, and I got a job at a local bookstore. Lila started taking art classes, her canvases filled with strange, unsettling images that she couldn't or wouldn't explain. We were trying to rebuild our lives, to find some semblance of normalcy. But it was hard. The nightmares were relentless. The phantom pains, those echoes of other versions of myself dying, still flared up from time to time, sharp and sudden and terrifying. And then there was Lila. She was different, changed. It wasn't just the trauma, although that was certainly a part of it. There was something else, something subtle, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. She would stare out at the ocean for hours, her eyes distant, her expression unreadable. She would wake up in the middle of the night, screaming, but unable to remember her dreams. She would draw those symbols, unconsciously, in the margins of her sketchbooks, on napkins, in restaurants, even in the condensation on the bathroom mirror, and sometimes when she thought I wasn't looking, I would see her, touch her palm, the place where I had brought the rock down, the place where the symbol had been etched. She would trace the faint white scar tissue with her fingertip, her face a mixture of fascination and fear. I tried to talk to her about it, to ask her what she remembered, what she felt, but she would always shut down, her eyes clouding over, her voice becoming distant and evasive. "I don't know," she would say. "I don't remember. I feel different." Then, one night, it all came to a head. We were sitting on the balcony, watching the sunset over the ocean. The sky was a blaze of color, oranges and reds and purples, reflecting off the water in shimmering waves. It was beautiful, peaceful, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had become my constant companion. Lila was silent, staring out at the horizon, her face pale in the fading light. Then she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. I see things, she said. I hear things. I turned to her, my heart pounding. What do you mean? What kind of things? She hesitated, her eyes darting around nervously, as if she were afraid of being overheard. Dreams, she said. Visions. I see the cave. I see the creature. I see the others. The others? I asked, my voice trembling. The chanting figures? She nodded. But it's more than that. I see other places, other worlds. I see him. Him? I felt a chill run down my spine. Who do you mean? She looked at me, her eyes wide, filled with a terror that mirrored my own. The one they were trying to bring through. The one from beyond. I stared at her, speechless. This was worse than I had imagined. It wasn't just trauma. It wasn't just nightmares. It was a connection, a link to that thing, to that other reality. Lila, I said, my voice shaking. What do we do? She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I don't know, but I think it's getting stronger. I think it's coming for me. And as she said those words, I felt it. A cold, creeping sensation, spreading through the air, through my body. The same sensation I had felt in the cave. The same sensation I had felt before the floor had given way. The world around us seemed to shift, to distort. The colors of the sunset became wrong, unnatural. The sound of the ocean, twisted, became a low, guttural growl. And then I saw it. Reflected in Lila's eyes, a flicker of green light, a glimpse of something vast and terrible, moving just beyond the veil of reality. It was coming, and we had nowhere left to run. I look to Lila and see her eyes wide and her hands covering her mouth, as if she was going to throw up. The green light intensified, growing brighter, more insistent, until it filled Lila's eyes completely, transforming them into twin pools of alien luminescence. The air crackled with an energy that made my hair stand on end, and the metallic scent, that ever-present reminder of the cave, became almost suffocating. I reached for Lila, my hand trembling, my mind screaming at me to run, to hide, to do anything to escape this encroaching horror. But I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a mixture of terror and a desperate, irrational hope that, somehow, I could still save her. "Lila!" I cried out, my voice a strangled gasp. "Fight it! Don't let it take you!" Her body convulsed, her back arching, her hands clawing at the air. A sound escaped her lips, a sound that was both a scream and a growl, a sound that was both human and utterly inhuman. The world around us continued to distort, the familiar shapes of the balcony, the ocean, the sky, melting and twisting into something grotesque and unrecognizable. I felt like I was falling into a void, a bottomless abyss of madness and despair. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The green light faded. Lila's eyes returned to normal, and the world snapped back into focus. The air cleared, the metallic scent receded, and the only sound was the gentle lapping of the waves against the shore. Lila collapsed, her body limp, her breathing ragged. I caught her before she hit the ground, cradling her in my arms, my heart pounding like a drum. "Lila? Lila, are you okay?" I whispered, my voice choked with emotion. She blinked, her eyes focusing on me slowly, her expression dazed and confused. "Ethan," she said, her voice weak. What happened?" I held her tighter, relief washing over me in a wave so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. She was back. She was herself. But for how long? We didn't speak of it again. Not that night. Not ever. We packed our bags, left the apartment, and moved on. Again. We tried to put it all behind us, to pretend it had never happened, to live a normal life. But it was impossible. The scars remained, the memories, the fear, and the knowledge that the world was not what we thought it was, that there were things out there, beyond our comprehension, beyond our control, things that were waiting, watching, hungry. We drifted apart, eventually. The shared trauma, the unspoken secrets, the constant fear. It was too much. We couldn't build a life on such a shaky foundation. I returned to my hometown, to the place where it had all begun. Not to the town itself, but to the outskirts. To a small cabin, deep in the woods. I needed to be close to it, to the forest, to the cave, to the truth. I spent my days hiking the trails, exploring the woods, searching for something. I didn't know what. Answers, closure, or maybe just a sign. A sign that I wasn't crazy, that it had all been real. And then, one evening, as I was sitting on the porch of my cabin, watching the sunset filter through the trees, I saw her, standing at the edge of the woods, silhouetted against the fading light, was a child, a small, slender figure with tangled hair and wide, dark eyes. The same child, the one I had found in the forest, the one who had started it all. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stood there, watching me. My heart leaped into my throat. I stood up, my legs trembling, my mind racing. Was this it? Was it starting again? I took a step towards her, my hand outstretched. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the silent woods. Who are you?" She didn't answer. She just smiled. A small, knowing smile. And then, she turned and vanished into the shadows, disappearing as quickly and silently as she had appeared. I stood there for a long time, staring at the spot where she had been, my mind filled with a mixture of fear, confusion, and wonder. The mystery remained, the questions unanswered. Was the child real? Was she a messenger? A warning? Or something else entirely? Was the creature in the pit truly gone? Or was it just waiting? And Lila? What had happened to her? Was she safe? Or was she lost? I didn't know. I would probably never know. But one thing was certain. The world was a stranger, more terrifying place than I had ever imagined. And the darkness, it was always there, just beneath the surface, waiting to emerge. And I would probably never feel truly safe again.